Every woman in Dry Creek watched the cowboy ride past their doors each morning, until he stopped at the same little bread stand again. Snow slapped hard against the bakery windows as Sadie stared at the brass key trembling in her flour-covered hand. Behind her, the new brick oven crackled with fresh firewood, and Bo Mercer stood silent near the doorway, snow melting off his coat onto the pine floorboards. Then he finally spoke, and what he said made her grip the counter just to stay standing. If stories like this still mean something to you, stay with us and share where you're watching from tonight. By the time the first streaks of gray touched the Wyoming sky, Sadie Calloway already had flour on both hands and apple peels curling beside the cutting board. Dry Creek woke slowly in autumn. The cattle trail west of town stayed quiet before sunrise, except for the low shuffle of horses and the creak of wagon wheels somewhere far off in the dark. Cold air slipped through the cracks of Sadie's little bake stand behind Miller's livery stable. The smell of yeast and cinnamon drifted into the empty street long before people appeared. She liked that hour best. Before boots hit the boardwalk, before gossip woke up with the town, before someone looked at her with pity they tried to hide. The lantern hanging near the flour shelf swung gently while she rolled dough with steady hands. Her sleeves were folded to her elbows. A faded blue shawl hung over the chair beside the stove. 3 years ago, her husband had wrapped that same shawl around her shoulders halfway up Miller Pass before the mountain gave way beneath the snow. Now the shawl smelled mostly like bread smoke and winter apples. Sadie slid 2 pies into the iron oven and wiped her hands on her apron. Outside, dawn finally touched the roofs of Dry Creek with pale silver light. The first customers came as they always did. Cowboys with trail dust still on their boots. Rail workers with stiff fingers wrapped around tin cups of coffee. A deputy who never smiled before noon. Most of them barely looked at her. Coin down, bread taken, gone again. Sadie never minded much anymore. People in Dry Creek had a way of looking through things that stayed too long in one place. Around 7, the wind shifted hard through the street. Dust swept beneath the awning overhead, rattling the loose wooden supports. Sadie glanced upward briefly, then back to slicing cornbread. That was when the horse stopped outside. The animal was dark chestnut, broad through the shoulders, steam rising faint from its nose in the cold morning air. The rider dismounted slowly, one gloved hand resting on the saddle horn before he stepped onto the boardwalk. Sadie recognized him immediately. Everybody in Wyoming Territory knew Bo Mercer. Black Hollow Ridge Ranch stretched farther than some towns. Men talked about his cattle contracts the way they talked about storms or railroad money. Women lowered their voices whenever his name came up. He pushed open the half door of the bake stand. Tall, quiet, dark coat dusted with road dirt, not dressed fancy. Just expensive in the practical way rich men sometimes were. Sadie reached automatically for a loaf. Morning. His eyes moved once across the shelves, the coffee pot, the fresh bread cooling beside the window. Then he pointed lightly toward the cornbread. One of those. His voice sat low and rough from the cold. Sadie wrapped the loaf in cloth and handed it over. Their fingers nearly touched before both drew back without thinking. He placed 2 coins on the counter. Then he looked directly at her. Not over her shoulder, not past her. At her. Much obliged, Mom. Something small caught inside her chest. She nodded once. You're welcome. Bo Mercer took the bread and left. That should have been the end of it. But the next morning, his horse stopped outside again. Same hour, same coat, same quiet voice. 1 cornbread loaf. By the 4th morning, people noticed. Sadie heard it in pieces while pouring coffee. Edith Gallo whispering near the supply store. 2 ranch hands talking beside the water trough. A woman laughing softly outside the barber shop. Why would Bo Mercer buy bread there every day? Sadie wondered herself. There were bigger places in town, cleaner ones. places with proper dining rooms and polished windows instead of flour dust caught in the corners. Yet every morning, Bo came to her stand. And every morning, without quite admitting why, Sadie pulled the warmest loaf aside before sunrise. One Thursday morning, the wind arrived angry from the north. It slammed across Dry Creek hard enough to send dust spinning through the street. The old awning above Sadie's stand groaned sharply overhead. She stepped outside just as one of the support posts cracked sideways. Oh no! She grabbed the edge before the whole thing collapsed. The canvas snapped violently in the wind, dragging her half forward with it. Sadie planted both boots hard against the boardwalk, struggling to keep the frame upright. Then another pair of hands caught the post. "Strong and steady, Bo Mercer." He said nothing, just shrugged out of his coat and dropped to one knee beside the broken support. Wind whipped through his dark hair while he worked the loosened bolts free, with a wrench pulled from his saddlebag. Dust coated his sleeves. Cold reddened his knuckles. Sadie stood holding the frame while he repaired it piece by piece beneath the screaming canvas. Neither of them spoke much, only small practical words. "Hold it there. Like this? That's fine." 20 minutes passed that way. When the final bolt tightened into place, Bo tested the support once with his palm. The awning held steady against the wind. He stood slowly, picked up his coat, brushed dust from one sleeve, then stepped back inside the bake stand, as if repairing buildings before breakfast was the most ordinary thing in the world. "One loaf," he said quietly. Sadie wrapped the bread more carefully than usual. When she handed it across the counter, Bo gave a slight nod. "Much obliged, Mom." Then he walked back into the cold morning street. Sadie stood still for several seconds after he disappeared beyond the livery stable. Outside, Dry Creek kept moving. Wagons rolled, men shouted, horses stamped against frozen dirt. But for the first time in a long while, the little bake stand behind the stable did not feel quite so empty anymore. The next morning, Bo Mercer returned at the same hour. The sky above Dry Creek still carried the pale blue color that came before sunrise. Frost clung white along the hitching rails outside Miller's livery. Sadie had just finished pouring coffee grounds into the tin pot when she heard the familiar rhythm of his horse slowing near the boardwalk. She did not look up immediately. For reasons she could not explain, she wanted to know whether she could recognize him now by sound alone. Turns out she could. The door creaked open. "One cornbread loaf," Bo said. Sadie wrapped the bread while steam curled around her hands. This morning she had baked 3 extra loaves before dawn. Without admitting it, even to herself, she had made sure one stayed hottest near the back of the stove. She handed it over. His fingers brushed the cloth briefly this time. "Warm from the oven." "Coffee?" she asked before she could stop herself. Bo paused. Most mornings he carried the bread away untouched. Nobody in town had seen him sit long anywhere except church funerals and cattle auctions. But after a second, he nodded once. "Black." Sadie poured the coffee into a thick white mug with a chipped handle and set it near the end of the counter by the window. Bo removed his gloves slowly, sat down and wrapped both hands around the cup without drinking. Outside, wagons rattled awake across Main Street. Inside, the stove ticked softly. Neither of them rushed to fill the silence. Sadie sliced apples behind the counter, while Bo sat near the window, watching the morning lighten over Dry Creek. Every now and then she caught him studying the steam rising from the coffee, as though he had forgotten what it felt like to sit still before sunrise. After several minutes, he finally tore a piece from the cornbread loaf. A small thing, but for reasons she did not understand, Sadie felt it settle somewhere deep inside her chest. By the end of the week, people noticed the pattern properly. Edith Gallo came by Thursday morning wearing a fox-trimmed coat and the sharp expression of a woman carrying information she intended to spread carefully. She bought 2 biscuits she did not need. then stood near the counter pretending to stir sugar into her coffee while Bo sat by the window with his usual black cup. "Well," Edith said lightly, eyes fixed on Sadie instead of Bo. "Some folks surely do develop habits." Sadie kept kneading dough. Bo continued drinking his coffee. The silence stretched just long enough to make Edith uncomfortable. She finally took her biscuits and left. The bell above the door jingled shut behind her. Sadie glanced toward Bo. "Sorry about that." He looked at her over the rim of the cup. "For what?" "For people talking." A corner of his mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile. "Town's always talking." Then he drank the rest of the coffee and stood to leave. That evening rain rolled down from the north. Cold rain. The kind that turned the streets to dark mud and left the wooden boardwalk slick beneath lantern light. Sadie was carrying flour sacks into the storage shed behind the bake stand when the side door swung open against the wind. Bo stepped inside, shoulders damp from rainwater. "We'll throw your back out lifting those alone," he said. Before she answered, he picked up one end of the crate nearest the door. Together they carried the flour through the narrow shed while rain hammered against the roof overhead. Lantern light shook gold across the walls every time the wind moved. At the final crate, Sadie slipped slightly on the wet boards. Bo caught the edge before it tipped. Her hand landed against his wrist. Solid, warm despite the cold. For one quiet second, neither of them moved. Rain drummed overhead, the lantern hissed softly. Then Sadie pulled her hand back first. "Thank you," she said quietly. Bo nodded once, though he remained standing there longer than necessary after the work was done, like he had forgotten for a moment that he was supposed to leave. By October, Sadie knew exactly how he liked the cinnamon rolls, slightly burned around the edges. Not sweet enough for most folks. She never asked how she knew that, only noticed which tray emptied whenever Bo stopped by. What unsettled her more was this. He still almost never ate inside. He would sit with coffee sometimes, stay longer than before, listen when she talked about flour shipments or the stubborn oven door that stuck every damp morning. But the food itself usually went back out the door with him. Until one Tuesday morning, the air smelled like chimney smoke and cold iron. Sadie set his usual loaf onto the counter while Bo removed his gloves. Then, instead of reaching for the bread, he broke off a piece and ate it there beside the window. Simple as that. Sadie looked up before she could help herself. Bo noticed. "Good this morning," he said. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. "Same recipe, maybe," he answered. Then he took another bite. Late that afternoon, while Sadie swept flour from the floorboards, young Eli Turner from Black Hollow Ranch stopped by carrying hay receipts folded into his coat pocket. The boy could not have been older than 14. He bought a biscuit and nodded toward the cloth wrapped around the remaining loaves. "Mr. Mercer still keeps the first one." Sadie blinked. "Keeps what?" "The cloth you wrapped his first bread in." Eli shrugged casually. "Seen it in his desk drawer when I brought account books last month." Sadie stopped sweeping. Eli took another bite of biscuit, unaware he had just shifted something enormous inside the room. "He gets sore if anybody touches it," the boy added. Old Ben joked about throwing it out once. Mr. Mercer near bit his head off. The door shut behind him a moment later. Sadie remained standing alone in the bake stand with the broom still in her hands. Outside, Dry Creek carried on with its usual noise, but inside the little room behind the stable, the evening suddenly felt very still. Sadie set the broom against the wall and looked toward the counter where Bo's coffee cup still sat from that morning. A faint brown ring circled the bottom. He always left exactly half an inch unfinished. She noticed that now. The realization unsettled her more than the boy's story had. That night, the temperature dropped hard across Wyoming territory. By dawn, ice crusted the water troughs outside the stable, and the wind carried the sharp metallic smell that usually meant snow was pushing down from the mountains. 3 mornings later, Bo Mercer did not come. Sadie noticed before she admitted she noticed. She kept the hottest cornbread near the stove anyway. Around 8, she finally wrapped it in cloth and set it aside beneath the counter. The next morning his chair near the window stayed empty again. Men coming off the trail talked while warming their hands around coffee mugs. Heard Black Hollow lost cattle up north. Storm trapped half the riders near Mercer Ridge. One of the horses came back lame without a saddle. Sadie sliced bread carefully and kept her eyes lowered. By evening, snow had started falling steady across Dry Creek. Big, heavy flakes drifted past the lanterns along Main Street and buried wagon tracks beneath soft white layers. Still no Bo. On the third night, old Ben Carter arrived at the bake stand just before closing. Snow clung thick to his hat brim and shoulders. The old ranch hand stamped ice from his boots near the door. "You still got broth left?" Sadie nodded slowly. "Some." Ben rubbed a weathered hand across his beard. "Mercer finally made it home this morning. Horse threw him coming down the north ridge." The ladle stopped in Sadie's hand. "Bad?" "Shoulders tore up pretty good. Fever now." Ben glanced toward the storm outside. "Doc can't get up there till morning if this keeps up." The wind howled sharply against the windows. Ben took the broth and left. Sadie stood alone beside the stove for a long while after the door shut. Then she moved. She packed quietly. Broth in a sealed tin. Fresh bread wrapped thick in cloth. Bandages. Willow bark powder. A lantern. Extra blankets. By the time she hitched the mule to the wagon, snow already covered half the road north out of Dry Creek. The trip to Black Hollow Ridge took nearly 2 hours. Wind pushed against the wagon hard enough to rattle the wheels loose over frozen ground. Twice Sadie nearly lost sight of the road entirely, where snow drifted across the trail. The Mercer Ranch finally appeared through the storm as scattered lantern lights beyond black fencing and half-buried corrals. The ranch house stood large against the snow, dark wood, wide porch. One upstairs window glowing dim gold through the blizzard. Old Ben opened the door before she knocked. His eyebrows rose slightly when he saw her. Then he stepped aside without a word. Inside smelled like wet wool, smoke, and fever heat. Bo lay upstairs in a narrow bedroom with one lamp burning low beside the bed. His shirt sleeve had been cut open near the shoulder. Bruising spread dark beneath the bandages. Even asleep he looked tense, like pain had followed him into his dreams. Sadie set the broth down quietly and touched the cloth at his forehead. "Too warm. He won't stay still long enough to heal proper," Ben muttered from the doorway. "Doc set the shoulder this morning. Fever came after." Sadie nodded once. "You should sleep some." Ben hesitated, then finally disappeared downstairs. The room settled into silence except for the wind outside. Sadie worked slowly. Fresh water, clean cloth, more wood in the stove. Near midnight, Bo stirred hard against the blankets, jaw tightening. "Easy," Sadie said softly before thinking about it. His eyes opened halfway. For one unfocused second, he simply stared at her. Then his breathing eased slightly. "Sadie?" The sound of her name in his rough, fevered voice moved through the room strangely. "I'm here." He tried to sit up and failed immediately. "That stubborn?" she asked quietly while helping him settle back again. A faint shadow of amusement crossed his face before disappearing. "Depends who's asking." She almost smiled. Almost. Later, while snow buried the ranch yard outside, Sadie sat beside the stove, mending one of the loose bandages under lamplight. Her hands smelled faintly of flour and cedar smoke. At some point, exhaustion finally caught her. She fell asleep in the chair near the fire with the sewing cloth still in her lap. Sometime deep in the night, Bo woke again. The fever had broken enough for his thoughts to clear around the edges. He looked across the room. Sadie slept curled sideways, beneath the lamplight, one hand tucked beneath her cheek. A streak of flour still marked the sleeve of her dress near the wrist. The sight of her there changed something inside the room. Or maybe inside him. The ranch house had felt empty for years. even full of ranch hands and noise. It carried the hostile sound of a place nobody stayed awake for anymore. But now there was somebody breathing softly beside the fire. Somebody who'd lived through a blizzard just to sit beside his bed and argue with his fever. Bo watched her quietly for a long moment. Then, somewhere between sleep and pain, he said softly, "Don't leave yet." Sadie stirred slightly in the chair. She heard him, but by morning she acted as though she had not. Gray winter light crept through the windows before dawn. The storm had weakened sometime during the night. Sadie gathered the empty bowls and folded blankets while Bo slept properly for the first time since she arrived. Before leaving, she crossed toward the desk near the far wall, looking for paper to leave instructions about the medicine. Then she stopped. There on the desk sat the old cloth she had once wrapped around his first loaf of bread, folded carefully. Beside it lay the faded baking twine she always used at the stand. And beneath both things sat a sheet of paper covered in measurements. Brick oven dimensions, counter lengths, vent placement. At the top, written clearly in Bo Mercer's hand, Sadie Calloway Bakery. Her breath caught. Outside, morning wind moved softly across the ranch fences while snow slid from the roof in quiet sheets. Sadie stared at the paper one moment longer than she meant to. Then she folded the blanket over Bo's shoulder carefully, blew out the lamp beside the bed, and walked downstairs into the pale winter morning. Snow still covered Black Hollow Ridge when she reached Dry Creek again. The storm had left the town hushed and heavy. Wagon wheels cut deep tracks through slush along Main Street. Smoke rose straight from chimneys into the cold white sky. Men spoke softer after hard weather, as if winter itself might overhear them. Sadie opened the bake stand before dawn the next morning. Her hands moved through familiar work automatically. Flour, water, salt, heat. But her thoughts stayed upstairs in Bo Mercer's ranch house beside that desk. Sadie Calloway Bakery. She had seen her own name written plenty of times before. On receipts, supply orders, tax notices folded beneath her door every spring. None of them had ever looked like hope. The bell above the bake stand door rang softly just after sunrise. Bo stepped inside. His shoulder was still stiff beneath the dark wool coat. A faint bruise colored one side of his jaw near the temple. He moved carefully, though not carefully enough to fool someone who had watched him sleep through fever. Sadie lowered her eyes back to the cutting board. "Morning, morning, Mom." His voice sounded rougher than usual. Neither of them mentioned the ranch, the storm, the sleepless night. Bo set his gloves beside the counter and sat at the usual chair near the window. Sadie poured coffee without asking. Outside, two ranch wives slowed noticeably while passing the windows. By the end of the week, the talking had sharpened. It no longer sounded curious. Now it sounded personal. Edith Gallo arrived Friday afternoon wearing dark green velvet and a smile too careful to be kind. 3 other women drifted near the shelves, pretending to study pies, while Edith warmed her hands around coffee she barely touched. "A man like Bo Mercer," Edith said lightly, "ought to remember certain responsibilities." Sadie continued kneading dough. Edith watched her hands while speaking. Black Hollow's one of the finest ranches in the territory. People notice who walks through those doors. One of the women beside her gave a soft laugh, especially widows. The room went quiet after that. Heat felt crawl slowly into her face, but kept working. She pressed the dough harder than necessary beneath her palms. Edith took another sip. "Of course," she continued sweetly. "Some folks mistake kindness for intention." The women finally left a few minutes later, trailing perfume and cold air behind them. Sadie stood alone at the counter long after the door shut. That evening, Bo stayed later than usual. The bake stand smelled like cinnamon and wet wool from coats drying near the stove. Snowmelt dripped softly from the awning outside. Bo sat with his coffee while Sadie wrapped leftover loaves in cloth. Finally, she said quietly, "People are talking. He looked up. They always talk. This feels different. Bo watched her for a moment without speaking. Then he stood slowly, favoring the injured shoulder slightly. Does it bother you? Sadie tied the cloth around the bread tighter than necessary. It should bother you. A long silence settled between them. The stove clicked softly behind the counter. Finally, Bo picked up his hat. Morning comes early, he said. Then he left. 2 days later, Loretta Pierce came alone. Sadie had seen her many times from across town. Beautiful in the polished way wealthy daughters often were. Perfect gloves, perfect posture. Hair pinned neatly beneath a cream-colored winter hat. She stepped into the bake stand just before noon, carrying no basket and no appetite. I'd like coffee, she said softly. Sadie poured it. Loretta sat near the stove but did not drink much of it. For a while she simply watched the snow falling outside. Then quietly she said, Bo's a good man. Sadie kept arranging bread. Yes. Loretta turned the untouched cup slowly between her hands. The trouble with men like him is the whole town starts believing they belong to everybody. Sadie did not answer. Loretta finally looked at her fully. My father says Black Hollow Ranch keeps this town alive half the winter. Her voice stayed calm. People expect certain things from the man running it. And what things are those? Loretta hesitated just briefly. A wife who fits beside him. The words landed gently, that somehow made them hurt worse. Before leaving, Loretta placed coins beneath the coffee cup, though she had barely touched it. At the door, she paused. A place like this, she said quietly, glancing around the bake stand. It's warm. But Bo Mercer was built for bigger rooms than this one. Then she stepped outside into the falling snow. That night, Sadie lay awake in the small room behind the stand, listening to the wind move against the windows. For the first time in weeks, she considered leaving Dry Creek, not dramatically, just quietly. Sell the oven, pack the wagon, find another town where nobody looked at her with curiosity disguised as pity. The thought stayed with her all through the next morning. Bo arrived as usual. Sadie did not set aside the warmest loaf this time. She handed him the bread without looking up properly. No extra coffee, no conversation. Bo noticed immediately, but he said nothing. The distance between them stretched quietly over the next few days like rope pulled too tight. Then came Saturday, the busiest morning of the week. Cowboys crowded near the counter shaking snow from their coats, while railroad workers lined up beside the coffee urn. The room buzzed with noise and steam and winter cold. Edith Gallo stood near the center of it all, perfectly positioned. Well, Edith announced loudly enough for the room to hear, some women certainly aim high these days. Conversation slowed. Sadie froze with a tray in her hands. Edith smiled faintly. I suppose feeding a man breakfast makes some people think they belong at his table forever. Nobody spoke, not one person. Then a chair scraped softly against the floorboards. Bo stood. He crossed the room without hurry and placed exact change beside his coffee cup. The room stayed completely silent. Snow tapped lightly against the windows. Bo looked at Edith once, then at Sadie. This woman fed half this town through 2 hard winters, he said calmly. No anger, no raised voice, just certainty. And she's got more honesty in her hands than most folks here got in their whole bloodline. Nobody moved. Edith's face drained pale beneath the lamplight. Bo picked up his bread and turned toward the door. Before leaving, his eyes met Sadie's briefly. Steady, quiet, protective. Then he walked back into the falling snow. The room slowly began breathing again after he left. But something in Dry Creek had shifted. Everybody felt it. The next morning, Bo Mercer did not come. Sadie noticed the empty chair before sunrise had fully reached the windows. She wrapped the hottest loaf anyway. By noon, it had gone cold beneath the counter. The following morning, his chair stayed empty again. Sadie stood near the stove, holding a coffee cup she had poured for no reason at all. Outside, snow blew across Main Street in pale ribbons beneath the gray Wyoming sky. And for the first time since Bo Mercer had walked into her bake stand, Sadie realized just how much of her mornings belonged to him now. The chair near the window stayed empty all through Sunday. By Monday afternoon, the untouched loaf beneath the counter had gone hard around the edges. Sadie still did not throw it away. That evening she closed the bake stand early. The weather had turned bitter again. Wind pushed snow dust through the gaps beneath the door, while she banked the stove fire low for the night. The room smelled faintly of coffee grounds and cinnamon. Quiet, too quiet. She was fastening her coat when somebody knocked once against the doorframe outside. Not loud, just enough. Sadie opened the door and froze. Bo Mercer stood beneath the lantern light with snow resting across the shoulders of his dark coat. Cold air moved around him in slow white gusts. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Bo said simply, "Come with me." Sadie looked past him toward the street. "Where?" "You'll see." That should have been the sort of thing a sensible woman refused, especially in a town already talking too much. But 10 minutes later, she found herself seated beside him in the wagon, beneath thick wool blankets, while the horse carried them north through the snowy streets of Dry Creek. The town had mostly gone dark by then. Only the saloon windows still glowed bright along Main Street. Somewhere far off, a train whistle echoed across the frozen flats near the rail line. Bo drove quietly. Sadie stole one glance toward him beneath the lantern swinging from the wagon rail. His injured shoulder still moved stiffly whenever he gathered the reins tighter against the wind. "You shouldn't be out in this cold yet," she said finally. "I'm fine. You say that even when you're not." A faint breath of amusement left him then, barely visible in the cold air. The wagon turned onto a smaller road near the new freight station north of town. A row of unfinished storefronts stood dark beneath drifting snow, except one. Warm golden light glowed behind wide front windows. Bo stopped the wagon there. Sadie looked up slowly. Fresh paint, new cedar boards, large front windows framed in black iron, and hanging above the doorway, not yet fully painted, was an unfinished wooden sign. She climbed down carefully from the wagon. The moment Bo opened the front door, warmth rushed out into the cold night air. Sadie stepped inside and stopped breathing for a second. Brick oven, real brick, large enough for 6 trays at once. Long pine counters smooth beneath fresh oil polish, copper hooks along the walls, deep shelves ready for flour sacks and preserves, glass jars already lined near the windows waiting for morning light. Everything smelled like cut wood and clean stone and new beginnings. Sadie moved slowly through the room, as though afraid it might disappear if she touched it too quickly. Her fingers brushed the edge of the counter. "You said once," Bo spoke quietly behind her, "that the old clay oven heated uneven on damp mornings." Sadie turned. He stood near the doorway, holding his hat in both hands. "You remembered that?" "I remember most things you say." The room fell silent except for the soft crackle from the stove in the back. Sadie looked again toward the oven, toward the shelves, toward the windows wide enough to catch sunrise over Dry Creek. "You bought this?" Bo nodded once. "Months ago." "Why?" He looked down briefly at the hat, turning slowly between his hands, then back at her. "The truth?" Sadie swallowed softly. "I'd prefer it." Bo stepped closer. Snow tapped lightly against the windows behind him. "The first morning I walked into your bake stand," he said. "I'd spent 3 nights sleeping at Black Hollow alone after burying another ranch hand. Whole house felt dead quiet." His voice stayed calm, steady. "Then I walked in there and smelled coffee and bread before sunrise." Sadie watched him without moving. "You looked me in the eye like I was just another tired man wanting breakfast." A faint smile touched one corner of his mouth. Not Bo Mercer, not a ranch owner, just somebody cold. His eyes held hers fully, now. That little stand behind the stable became the only place in town that stopped feeling lonely. Something inside Sadie gave way at those words. Not loudly, Just quietly, like snow slipping from a roof. Bo crossed the final distance between them and reached into his coat pocket. A ring did not appear. Instead, he placed a heavy brass key gently into her palm. I figured if a place can feel like home before sunrise every morning. His voice roughened slightly then. Maybe the woman inside it already is. Sadie stared down at the key, resting against her flower-roughened hand. For 3 years, she had survived by keeping herself small enough not to need too much. Small room, small stand, small hopes. But standing there inside that warm bakery, with snow falling beyond the windows, and Bo Mercer looking at her like she mattered, she suddenly understood how tired she was, of shrinking herself to fit what other people expected. Her eyes burned unexpectedly. The first tears she had allowed herself in years slid quietly down her face. Bo stepped closer immediately. Concern flickered across his expression. Sadie. She laughed softly through before wiping them away with the heel of her hand. You built a whole bakery before asking me anything. A shadow of embarrassment crossed his face then. Seemed practical. That made her laugh harder. Warmth finally broke through the ache, sitting inside her chest. Bo looked relieved hearing it. Then quieter now, more careful than before, he asked, "Would you let me spend the rest of my life buying bread from you?" Sadie looked around the room once more. At the oven, at the windows, at the future he had quietly built with his own 2 hands long before she ever knew. Then back at him. "Yes," she whispered. Bo closed his eyes briefly, like a man finally setting down something heavy. When he opened them again, his hand found hers naturally. Outside, snow continued falling softly over Dry Creek, while warm light filled the bakery windows for the very first time. And maybe that's the part that stays with you long after the story ends. Not the new bakery, not the ranch, not even the wedding waiting somewhere ahead in the winter snow. It's the quiet way 2 lonely people found their way back to life through ordinary mornings. A cup of coffee before sunrise, a warm loaf wrapped in cloth, a chair by the window that slowly stopped feeling empty. If you've ever sat in a quiet room wondering whether anyone truly sees you, then maybe you understand Sadie more than she ever knew. And if you've ever carried grief so long it became part of your routine, maybe you understand Bo too. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes through small things repeated with care. A familiar voice at the door. A hand that stays. Someone remembering what matters to you when the rest of the world barely notices. That's what love looked like in Dry Creek. Not perfect, not dramatic. Just steady enough to make 2 people feel less alone. And maybe that's all most of us are really hoping for. If this story stayed with you tonight, tell me where you first felt your heart soften. And if you'd like, stay a little longer with us here. There are still more dusty roads, winter towns, and quiet love stories waiting just beyond the next lantern light.